Lynn, is it possible for you to pin my video and then folks only see me? So let me just introduce myself. I am Kristi Taylor. I'm the Education Director with the Advocacy Center of Tompkins County. And basically what I do here is I oversee our education team at the Advocacy Center. We are the domestic violence and sexual violence service provider for Tompkins County, which is best known for kind of the larger city of Ithaca. Well, larger city, depending on what your world is. I grew up in the country. So the city of Ithaca, and then we have a number of much more rural communities that we encompass. And we provide a lot of different crisis services to folks who've been impacted in some way by domestic or sexual violence, and to folks of all ages. So we are also the organization in Tompkins County that manages our local Child Advocacy Center response for the folks that are from Child Advocacy Center programs. We also house that program through our agency. So we are working with our multidisciplinary teams of different service providers to help youth after they've experienced some type of physical or sexual abuse, and really help navigate that process. I also acknowledge, and part of the reason I dropped this picture in here is in most cases, we're all working from home. So we are all working in a bit of a different reality during this pandemic. But I think there can be some misnomers about the availability of support for survivors or continuation of doing this important work. Also, one piece of the work that I do in Tompkins County is work with our local safe harbor critical teams, specifically addressing and raising awareness about commercial sexual exploitation of children or sex trafficking, as it's sometimes referred to, which is why I'm so excited to be working with Bridget, who's our local safe harbor coordinator, and a lot of different folks and service providers throughout our community that all kind of come together to try to provide some more skills in a broader sense of how to address this issue in our community. So one of the things that I think is really important to frame is when we started thinking about this conference or this summit, a few of us had been talking about, we need to talk about tech safety. We need to talk about the realities. There's a lot of questions out there about how does technology intersect with victimization of youth and sexual exploitation of youth. And while we recognize the need for that, one of the pieces that we wanted to do was really frame it in a slightly different way. Oftentimes when we hear about tech safety, we often hear about it in this way that can be incredibly overwhelming for parents or caregivers or adults that have youth supporting roles in their lives. Is how am I supposed to keep up? Maybe I didn't grow up in the same technology generation. Maybe I don't feel as confident or competent in navigating these things. And I feel like I need to understand all the nuances of the new apps and the ever-changing environment of the digital world to be able to keep youth safe. And when we start approaching it from that framework, it often becomes a vilifying of technology as bad and dangerous. But it also is so overwhelming that we can get frozen and not quite know what to do, because it feels like if I don't understand all these things or I can't keep up, then I can't actually keep youth safe. So when we started approaching how do we want to frame this, we started to think about a visual similar to what you see on your screen right now, which is how do we make this more tangible, and how do we make it less scary to approach it. And so through the 2 days, this is kind of how we frame things, is starting in this remote. Let's acknowledge the fact that technology is not going away. Technology and the digital world are a reality of our lives, and that could not be more true than what you are seeing right now with the pandemic. I feel like the people who are going to have business booming through the roof are our ophthalmologists and optometrists, because I don't know what your experience is, but my experience is spending so much time on screens, and the only way that I'm connecting with other people in most cases is through remote platforms. And that is no different for our youth. So it was already present there, but now it has just exploded to how much time and space we are engaging with the virtual world. And there's some really good pieces of that, and then there's some challenges. And so Janice really laid out this morning a little bit more about what are some of the environments that our youth and adults, for that matter, are navigating through the remote world, and how do we acknowledge that without putting a value judgment on it, because then we can really start to move through it. The next piece, when we're thinking about kind of this prevention format and understanding what's happening with trafficking or exploitation, is how do youth needs and youth development play into the exploitation that may be taking place? I really love this phrase, and actually Janice had it on one of her slides this morning, is trafficking is really the commodification of vulnerabilities. It's really taking advantage of the expected developmental vulnerabilities, or what I often think about as needs, that we have as humans, but that youth also have as part of that, and maybe have some extra ones just because of where their development is at. And so the talk that we're going to have today is really focused on this component, is how are folks who are exploiting youth commodifying those vulnerabilities or those youth needs, and what does that look like, and how do we think about this in a different way? Once we can start to acknowledge that, we can start to really think about then those practical skills. And so Lynn, my colleague who is doing our tech stuff right now, the presentation that's going to be coming up after this really focuses pretty deeply on boundaries and thinking about a culture of how do we increase connections that have clear boundaries, and how does that actually reduce risk of youth exploitation, and really kind of putting it in a different framework. So we'll be talking a little bit about that. I'll introduce it just a touch in today's talk, but we'll dig deep into it. And that leads a bit into the violations. How do we pay attention when those boundaries are being violated? What does that look like? And then, of course, how do we respond? How do we kind of help that healing process, or holding somebody accountable should that need to happen, and placing responsibility really where it belongs? So when I'm kind of thinking about this, and when we're putting this series of talks together, this is really that arc. And this workshop will talk a bit more about this kind of middle block, or this early block here, around youth needs, and how does that kind of work together. One of the other things that you will hear us say a number of times that I think is a core message, is that when we're talking about exploitation of youth and the behaviors of folks who are doing that, or who are taking advantage of situations, the behaviors that we're paying attention to and the approaches that we can use to increase the safety and well-being of youth are not terribly different than what you're seeing in the kind of in real life, the in-person interactions. And so one of the things that I like to do to take down that sense of overwhelmedness in youth safety around technology is remembering that we actually do a lot of stuff already that can help youth be safe, whether it's in person, face-to-face contact, or it's in the kind of online or virtual world. And I want us to hold that as we kind of talk through. So important language that I want to start with, because I want to make sure that we're all generally on the same page. about the language that I'm using and what it really means. So you will hear me kind of bounce in between predator, offender, also exploiter, as I've been saying. I think there's some trickiness around these words, and part of the reason that I flip-flop between them a little bit is because I don't love them, and just being really blatant. And the reason that I don't love them isn't because they aren't accurate. It's because we have developed a lot of stereotypes about who fits into this category. And when we hear words like predator, right, we oftentimes will imagine all of the stereotypes about who exploits or harms youth. Older doesn't fit the socially accepted image of what's attractive, or a convicted sex offender, or somebody who's would be in the trench coat jumping out of the bushes. And I'm not to say that there are not people who don't fit those stereotypes. Stereotypes get developed for a reason. But if we only put that picture in our mind and we only help youth envision that somebody who is trying to exploit them will look or be or fit that image, we are actually decreasing their safety. And the reason for that is that whether it's in person or online, somebody who is trying to harm them certainly could be a stranger, could fit that picture. But more often, it's probably somebody that they know in some way, they have some connection to, or is connected to your family in some way, and likely doesn't fit that visual image as well. It may be somebody who is very likable, that they've built a relationship with or has similar interests to them. And oftentimes, as we'll talk about, that will actually be the narrative, especially on an online world, that will be put forward, that this is actually somebody like me, because in my mind, somebody like me who has the same interests as me, who looks like me, who shares identities as I do and values, is a safe person. And so I will use this language slightly for a lack of other words, but I am challenging us to break down the stereotype of who we envision or who we think about when we're using those words. Some of the other terms, commercial sexual exploitation of children, you'll sometimes hear me refer to that as CSEC. I will define that in just a minute. Sexual exploitation we'll talk about, and of course, grooming. So CSEC and trafficking and sexual exploitation. This is an image that is developed from GEMS. I changed the colors a little bit, but GEMS is Girls Education and Mentoring Services out of New York City, founded by Rachel Lloyd. And Rachel Lloyd is somebody who has survived commercial sexual exploitation and trafficking. And she then built this organization to help other, her focus is on girls and young women, but other folks who have been and experienced trafficking, and trying to help support them, help them leave the life, and find resources to heal, and also find other ways to kind of meet the needs that were being met by that trafficking. So just giving credit to an incredible survivor-led organization and the work that they've done. So when we talk about the terms of sex trafficking, there is so much misinformation in the world right now, and really to a harmful and dangerous level. That term has been co-opted in ways for other purposes that are actually creating challenges for survivors to be able to find safety and healing, and that are overwhelming some service organizations as well with information that's not accurate and based on kind of disinformation that's in the world. And so I want to make sure that we have the opportunity to kind of challenge that and put some different information in the world, because that actually helps us keep youth safe. So when you look at this image, one of the reasons I really like it is that whether we're talking about trafficking or CSEC or sexual exploitation, it is all a form of child sexual abuse. And the reason that I think that is so important is because exploitation of youth, actually, either for commercial purposes or otherwise, is not new. It has become kind of the topic of the time, and I do think we've done a better job of having definitions over the last couple decades, and tracking it and doing better education and raising people's awareness to the issue. But it has been around for a very long time, and it was often just couched under a form of child sexual abuse, which is what it still is. And so one, I like to acknowledge that there are folks who have experienced this from many, many years ago, but also a lot of us feel like we do have the skills to do some basic prevention work or understanding or talking with youth about child sexual abuse. And a lot of those skills are transferable to talking about preventing sexual exploitation or commercial sexual exploitation. So again, taking down that overwhelmedness that can come from thinking about having to address something that feels so new and different. So then looking at this sexual exploitation, well, actually, sorry about that. I'm going to start with CSEC and trafficking. I am giving general definitions. I recognize that we may have some folks here who are from district attorneys' offices and maybe the law enforcement arm. I am not necessarily giving a legal definition of what could be charged or prosecuted. There are distinctions of kind of factors that have to be there for different actual crimes to be charged. What I'm talking about is kind of the general community or understanding of what these issues are. So oftentimes CSEC and sex trafficking get used interchangeably in the work that I do. And for the most simple term, what we're really talking about is when a person, sorry, I want to just make sure I have the right words here. Sexual exploitation or commercial sexual exploitation is when a person exchanges something of value or the promise of an exchange of something of value for some type of sexual act. And that can be in person or online. So a couple important pieces there is that something of value. Oftentimes it could be money, right? If you send me this sexual image or a nude image or a video of you engaged in some type of sexual act, then I will pay you for it, right? This is the traditional idea of what we think about with trafficking or kind of the commodifying here of sexual actions. But it doesn't necessarily have to be money. It could also be a place to stay. I am a youth who has run away. It's not safe for me at home. And this person has said, I can sleep here tonight, but I have to engage in a sexual act with their roommate or them, right? That's something of value, can be meeting some basic needs as well. So it can also be the promise of, maybe the money never was paid or you still weren't able to stay, or the drugs that were going to be in exchange are also never actually exchanged, but that was the promise and the expectation that was going to be there. So there's some type of commercial aspect to this. There's some type of exchange of something of value or promised. And that's where you start to get that kind of commercial component of the sexual exploitation. In a broader sense, sexual exploitation could include a lot of those same behaviors, but there may not be the promise or the actual exchange of something of value in there. As we go through today, I will probably use just the term of sexual exploitation to look at the broad picture of what we're talking about. because the behaviors that lead up to the opportunity for that to take place tend to be very similar, regardless of which layer it actually falls into. And then the last term, and this kind of digs into where we're going and where we'll spend our time today, is the concept of grooming. Grooming is a term that I bet most folks in here, if you've done any type of work around child sexual abuse in general, I know we have some folks from child advocacy centers, it's probably a term that you've heard because grooming is not new. This is something that has been recognized for a very long time within the child sexual abuse world, and understanding to answer that kind of age-old question, how did I miss this? How did I not know this was happening? How were they able to get away with it for so long? Think about people that are abusing hundreds and hundreds of youth, and you go, but how? And how did nobody see this or hold them accountable? Oftentimes it links back to this concept of grooming. And it is a well-documented tool that people who are offending are utilizing. And so for an actual definition, it's an intentional process by which predators are able to build relationships with youth or their targets, and to desensitize them to boundary violations and sexualized interactions. So there's a couple really important pieces here, and the first of which is the fact that it's intentional. People who are exploiting youth know what they're doing, and they know that they need to get over some hurdles to be able to be successful, and to also see if they'll be caught or not. And so while it can feel really hard to think about people being so calculated about it, this is actually the reality of some things that we see with people so it's an intentional process. It is very methodical. It can also, progress over time. It is often not something where it's a one-time interaction, because what they need to do is build that relationship and kind of test things in there. So some of the other pieces of grooming that we often talk about, and I even have it on here, right? Build relationships with youth. What's their goal of grooming? One of the big failings that I think we sometimes do when we talk about grooming is we only talk about what that exploiter or that offender has done to actually target the youth that they're exploiting or that they're abusing. And we leave out the fact that grooming is actually multi-layered. People who are offending, whether it's in person or it is through online or technology means, you often see very similar patterns where, yes, of course, they are going to groom the targeted youth and do some testing and desensitizing them to different things. But we're also going to see them grooming the people around that youth. So that could be family. If they have contact and they're known to your family, it could also be friends of that youth, if that's what it is. So maybe in an online world, you have grooming that starts to take place in gaming spaces. If it's the same group that gets together, maybe you don't know each other personally in real life, but when that person who's looking to exploit the youth is grooming the youth, they're also setting up a narrative about themselves and grooming the friends that are also in that same group. And you start to see that in a really powerful way when then it also can expand to grooming community or organizations. And the reason that they do this is because it helps provide them cover, right? It helps them to not be caught or held accountable if the youth comes forward or somebody else recognizes what is happening. So when you think about cases like Larry Nassar, right, who has become ubiquitous in the child sexual abuse world as the all-time example of grooming. When you answer that question, where you can hear stories where he was able to abuse by physical contact young women while their parents were in the room, and you go, how could that possibly happen? It's grooming. It is, I have developed such a persona of being trusted, of making you doubt what you're seeing in front of your face, of being, a lauded person, of shutting down all the other questions that people brought up when they had pause and went, that doesn't seem right, and making justifications for it so that if you're the one who brings it up, you can feel crazy, right? Or you dismiss it outright. That's grooming. And so if we're in that online world and it's an isolated space and you have a person who has created a persona and normalized these behaviors, it makes it really hard for anybody to recognize that what is happening is wrong and has started to progress and cross lines. And so this is that important kind of component to hold there. So feel free also, folks, if you have questions that we've kind of dropped some of these in the chat. I'm not totally paying attention, but if there's something that feels like, Kristi, you're really confusing me, please put it in there. So when we really think about kind of this grooming, this is what we're accomplishing. The question that often comes back to is how? How did they do it? How are they so effective? And why are youth, and when I say youth, I mean kind of teens, tweens, it could be younger than that as well, but kind of that encompassing package. Why are they targeted so often? And why is it so successful? And when I think of that, I actually like to take it out of the terms of sexual abuse or the actual behaviors of it. And I like to use an analogy about filling the jar, because I actually think this is what offenders and exploiters are doing so effectively. So I'm not sure if anybody here has ever seen, I've definitely seen this floating on social media in different places, but the story about the professor and the jar. And what the basic story is that you have a professor who stood in front of his class and he took out a large empty glass jar. And without saying a whole lot, he started to add some large rocks to the jar. And he asked his class after he kind of, got it to this place, he goes, is the jar full? And most of the students in the class went, yes, of course, the jar is full, right? There are large rocks that are filling this jar. That jar is full. In response to that, he doesn't say much, but what he does is then he takes out pebbles and smaller rocks and he pours them in that jar and he shakes it a little bit so that they start to settle into those open spaces and they fit. So then he asks the same class, is the jar full? And they all kind of giggle and go, oh yeah, now the jar is full, right? And then without saying much, he takes out a bag of sand and does the same thing. And the sand starts to settle into those additional open spaces. And he then goes in, and I will say, if you actually follow this story, there is a different kind of outcome here. But I've seen this story, and as I talk about grooming, or I talk about why teens and tweens and youth are so often targeted, this filling the jar concept just really resonates with me, because this is what exploiters are doing. They are filling the open spaces in the jar, right? They are taking up space in the jar. So when we talk about youth by development and by where they are in life and depending on who they are and what resources they have access to are going to have more or less space in the jar. to fill. And offenders are really exceptional at identifying what those spaces are that they can fill, either authentically or by lying, and kind of identifying those things. And the more space they can fill up in the jar, the more that they can start putting out and pushing out other things that are in there. And oftentimes we refer to this as youth vulnerabilities, right? Youth are vulnerable. And that is why an offender is so able to kind of take up that space or fill that space. I definitely use that language sometimes, and I think it has its place. But I think the more important piece of this is really exploring everybody's vulnerable in some way. We as human beings can be vulnerable to somebody who wants to take advantage of something about our lives, because what they're really doing is targeting our needs. And by switching our language away from vulnerabilities to more thinking about a needs-based approach, vulnerabilities has a really negative connotation, and it makes it seem like there's something wrong with teens or youth because they have these vulnerabilities that are being taken advantage of. It also feels very static when we use the language of vulnerabilities. It feels like there's nothing we can do about it, and that's actually not a truthful thing. And that is what offenders are relying on. They're relying on our inability to feel like we can do anything. And so then we leave more and more of those gaps for them to fill. And so, this kind of comes into the place of teen identities and these needs. And so what is it that they're taking care of? I wonder if in the chat, since I've been talking quite a bit, if folks are willing to drop, what are some needs that you can think are developmentally expected or might be present based on who a youth is, that potentially somebody could exploit? So I'm going to give you a couple minutes to just kind of drop some stuff in the chat of what are some of those things that you think might be exploited. Great. So, and please feel free to do all panelists and attendees, but somebody put looking for love or acceptance, need for belonging, absolutely. Emotional needs, validation, affection, connection, basic needs, yeah. Anything else people can think of? Protection, choice, love, right? Some of these are coming to the whole group. Some of these are coming kind of just directly to me. Tech desires, yeah, the wants, right? We all have desires of things that we want. And sometimes that, you could identify that as a need, but that is absolutely something that we see with all people, but youth. Great. Material things, extra money. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's needs. We can come up with all of these, right? We can sit here and probably have, if we were in person, a little bit easier, and half an hour long brainstorm about what are the things that teens need to kind of fill their jar in order to not create that space for somebody to exploit. So you all hit on some of the big ones, so let's kind of talk about them. One of the first ones that I think of very often is the basic needs and safety. And so when I talk about basic needs, I'm talking about the bottom layer of that Maslow hierarchy of needs, right? The safe place to stay, shelter, food, and feeling like they have access to physical health needs, and also that those places are actually safe. So we have a number of youth who are certainly having some more space in that jar or have additional needs because they have a place to stay, but it's not actually a safe place to stay. And that could be because they are experiencing some type of physical or sexual or emotional abuse at home by the folks who are supposed to be caring for them. It could also be that it doesn't feel emotionally safe because they have identities that aren't accepted or are actively attacked. So our LGBTQ plus youth who are not being accepted or are being told that they're wrong or damaged in some way if they come out to parents or caregivers, or the way that they express their gender is not accepted or is a source of kind of violence against them as well. So when we talk about the basic needs, these are the core things that we often hear as opportunities, right? These are the big rocks in the jar. If we don't have the big rocks in the jar full, there is a lot of space in there for somebody to exploit from a teen or our youth. So we want to really be thinking about that because the first thing, when that example, right, a safe place to stay. You can stay here, but this is what needs to happen in effect. Or, what we often hear, and we sometimes refer to this as the form of sexual exploitation that we are often hearing locally, is often called survival sex, which is that commodification of a basic need in exchange for something of a sexual nature, right? So really kind of thinking about how do we start with those big boulders in the rock, in the jar. One of the other needs is this want for independence. It is developmentally expected and actually healthy for youth to be saying at a certain point, I can kind of stand on my own 2 feet and I want to have more independence separate from everybody making decisions for me or, telling me what I can or can't do or have these really restrictive lives. It's this interesting dichotomy is we actually want to build that in youth because at some point they do need to be able to be functioning independent from their caregivers. And that thing that we're trying to build can also be an opportunity that gets exploited, especially in that kind of struggle for independence where caregivers are looking to pull them back and they're going, no. I really want to kind of be on my own. And that validation of maturity. In a grooming process, what you will often hear somebody who is grooming a youth do is go, they just don't understand you. They don't understand how mature you are, how different you are than those other people, right? Than other, girls your age or boys your age or people your age, right? They will set that up because then what we do, they know that as caregivers or as adults supporting youth is often they set us up, right? They set us up to then validate that experience. So a youth is going to push past our rules or our boundaries or that kind of stuff. And what we often will respond with is, you are just not ready for that. You aren't mature enough for that, or you're not ready for that. And that may not be totally untrue, but if they're being groomed by this other person over here who's already put the thought in their head that your parents or your caregivers or that youth worker just doesn't understand how different you are, unintentionally, we have now just validated that. And it's a really kind of tricky balance because offenders are also very good at knowing the things that we do and how to kind of set us up. That's part of the grooming that we experience, as well as that kind of second layer. One of the other pieces that is exploited, and I started to talk about this a little bit, is a desire and a need for youth to connect with people of similar identities. And this is one of those things where the internet has actually done a tremendous service, right? If you are a teen of color or a Black youth who lives in a really rural community that is predominantly white, and you don't have access to other people who live a similar experience in this world, the internet can actually create spaces to connect with other people who can really deeply and authentically identify with maybe some of the struggles or the differences of what it's like to grow up in communities in our culture where you may not see folks who look like you, who share that same way of walking through the world. And you can say that about a million different identities. I mentioned gender identity or LGBTQ youth, folks with disabilities, maybe intellectual disabilities or physical disabilities, right? In our world right now, you may have folks involved with activism and looking for folks who are also doing social justice work or political identities. Maybe a youth's political identities and views are different than that of the people that they're living with or are mostly surrounded by, right? All of these identity pieces, the internet can create huge connections that can actually be life-saving and validating and developmentally incredibly healthy. It can also provide a really big in for somebody who wants to take advantage of that want to connect and that need, that true human need to connect with people who live similar life experiences as you. And, you know, I'm even saying this, right? And for shorthand, we often say youth, or we talk about teens or tweens or children as this monolith. And what that does when we don't take the time to acknowledge the individualism, the identities, and life experiences of individual youth that we have in our lives or that we are caring with, we often miss the opportunity to recognize that they have some needs to connect with other folks who are similar to them, or we unintentionally flatten that and dismiss those needs as not real or valid. And when we're doing those things, we are creating openings. We're creating openings for somebody to take advantage of that, because I can guarantee you somebody who is looking to exploit a youth will pick those things out. They are masters at identifying needs or vulnerabilities and filling that space. So if we don't look at a youth as a whole person, you best believe that somebody else who wants to take advantage of that will at least present themselves, act like they're looking at them as a whole person, act like they understand what their life experiences are, and try to fill that space, right? That's and it may not be real. They may not have those same identities, or they may not believe those same things, but it doesn't actually matter, because if they're saying the right things, that is how they can fill that space and start to create disconnection with other people around them. Desire to be normal, right? And I put normal in quotes because there is no one way of being and being part of a group. This is a big piece of that. I think if you can say that you know a teen who doesn't want to be wanted or part of the group or not unique, you know, and kind of in that isolated way, it's just not real. It's part of the development. It's totally expected. So if I can have somebody who's saying to me, yeah, that's normal. It's normal to wonder about those things. It's normal to look that way or engage in those activities. I'm here to validate that for you, right? That is really, really powerful and compelling. And the last one that I pulled out, which, let's be clear, this is not the entirety of you know, needs that can be taken advantage of or used by offenders. But this is also a really common one that is incredibly common to be exploited because it meets a couple needs. Curiosity about sex or sexuality. So we heard Janice talking about this a lot, and why you have so many younger folks or people in general accessing pornography and accessing it. One, is very readily accessible, but young folks are identifying that it's also a place where they're learning and answering questions and kind of exploring that. And so that's developmentally expected. It's healthy. It is something that we would expect to see. It's also something that can be really easily exploited by offenders. And the dual function of it being exploited is not only am I building a connection with you and I'm making you feel like maybe I'm the first person who's ever told you as a young woman who maybe is exploring what is my sexuality. Am I bisexual? Am I a lesbian? I'm questioning some of these things. Not only might I be the first person to say, yeah, that's totally normal. There's so many people who are like that, or that's really great, or whatever, right? Manipulating that. But they also then have introduced and started to normalize sexualized conversations. And so we now have started at a further along kind of point in the process where we expect that if I continue or make the conversations more graphic or move further into this, I didn't actually have to build up any kind of rapport and then start to drop in sexualization to the conversation. We already started there. So it can really speed up that process and something to be kind of thoughtful about, but a very common thing that we see. I want to pull out, I didn't have this until I listened to Janice talk this morning, and if you weren't able to join her talk, she shared a story about a family friend who had an 11-year-old, 10 or 11-year-old daughter who had, out of curiosity around sex and sexuality and stuff that she was learning in her health class, had unintentionally kind of Googled and found pornography. And it brought up a lot of feelings for her, and then she continued to kind of explore it because it was curious and there is a healthy curiosity there, but she started to feel really guilty and really bad because she didn't understand why her body was feeling the way that it was feeling. And she had ingrained in her mind that this is a bad thing, but didn't have any consciousness as to why. And so started to feel more and more guilt, more and more what I would consider shame around that. And her parents were able to kind of notice that there was some behavior shifts, there was something going on. Approach her, intervene, create a space for her to talk about it, and then really talk through, right, that it's normal to have feelings and let's talk about this and all of these kinds of things. And it's a great example of how to help, what can happen with youth who aren't prepared for the internet or when they're exposed to things that they didn't expect, and a great kind of adult intervention to help normalize and then redirect some of those feelings or behaviors. Maybe it's because I do this work so much, or I've been doing this for quite a while, but when I heard that, I went, wow, I wonder, had that been a youth who, same thing, was out of curiosity, they Googled something, they unintentionally came across porn, and then started to kind of go back to it, and they started to go into that shame cycle. If they didn't have the adults who recognized what was going on in their life, that young person didn't have a lot of youth programs that they were engaged with, and they had more room in that jar, and they were starting to go into that shame spiral. If they had come across either in person or online an adult who wanted to exploit that, how they could have filled that space, how they could have validated those feelings in a way that then led to exploitation or abuse of that youth. Because that's what they do. Because they could potentially validate, yeah, that's totally normal, but then they could twist it and write their own narrative that then made the youth so much more vulnerable to the abuse, but also that they could have written the narrative to normalize the abuse as well, that this is what it's supposed to feel like. This is how it's supposed to be. This is okay. And that's what the grooming process really is it's taking these normal, healthy, developmentally expected needs and filling them, but twisting them in a way to be able to exploit the youth, but also make it less likely for them to tell anybody about it or be held accountable for it. So I've now probably terrified you all, which is not my intention, because there are some things we can do. And some of the pieces that we can start to really think about is how do we pay attention to some behaviors in other people that are around our youth that are linked in some ways to potentially exploitive or harmful behaviors. And how do we also build some of these capacities for youth to be able to think long before it gets to a point where it's sexualized or we're kind of already into a deep manipulation phase, is some earlier behaviors that we can pay attention to and go, that seems off, right? And that doesn't seem quite right. And so these are some of these behaviors that I want to think about. And I will say most of this came from a program that's actually a sexual violence prevention program for freshmen women in college called, what I call EAAA. It's the Enhanced Assess Acknowledge Act program developed by Dr. Charlene Sen of the Sayre Center in Canada. And it is a really effective program and has been shown to reduce actual experiences of rape or attempted rape in this kind of narrow pocket, very highly researched. And one of the components of the curriculum is to help rewrite the concepts of expected social scripts and what is okay or what is not okay. And so a component of that is that they actually did some research about men in particular who had ultimately sexually assaulted or raped a woman, whether it was convicted or not, and some of the common behaviors that were there. And I think, while that research wasn't done necessarily for this particular use, these behaviors are really common and overlaying. And I think the more that we can start to recognize and okay that we can challenge some of these things or say something's wrong here when they're happening is really powerful. So the first one is when we start to see people displaying a lot of persistence in boundary pushing, right? And this doesn't necessarily have to be around a sexual behavior or asking for something. Oftentimes when we talk with youth, or even we start to think about behaviors that are not okay when we're trying to do sexual assault or abuse prevention, is we give examples that are like, they ask you for a nude picture, you say no, and they continue to pressure you. Absolutely, that is an example of persistence, pushing past your boundary, even though you've said no. But what we often see is that there was actually signs of persistence and boundary pushing in non-sexual situations earlier than that. And we often dismiss them. And so what I'm encouraging is us to take notice of that. So maybe it's not that we're actually in a sexualized moment, but it's one of those things where they want them to give them their phone number, give them their real name if they're using a handle on a gaming platform or something like that. And teens often, and we don't give enough credit for this, often teens do try to set boundaries. But there's so much persistence and manipulation that comes that we don't see that pattern. So the persistence may not be about a sexual nature initially. Maybe it's about asking for their real name or to be able to chat through, Facebook Messenger or something else. And they get the no, but then they keep going and they keep going and they keep going. Or they somehow find that information and just blatantly push past the boundary and send them a message. And now I've just normalized that communication, right? So persistence and boundary pushing is one of those things that I would certainly pay attention to, whether it's in person or it's through some type of technological means. This is also if you happen to know some of the adults and you've set a boundary about how they're communicating with your youth that are in your life, and they're continuing to persist or push past those boundaries. This is where they're grooming you to see if you will react or reset that boundary or what the consequence is going to be. This is the testing part that we often see in grooming. Sexualizing non-sexual spaces or conversations. So this is where I drop the dirty joke or I make some comment that was off color. We were talking about biology and I turned it into like, oh yeah, let me talk about biology, right? I put a sexual undertone to it. Again, the challenge that we get in the virtual world, as we heard Janice talking about this morning, is sometimes offenders will take advantage of the fact that there is some expectation that things will push past your boundaries or be sexualized in a component. And that it won't be as easily picked up on, but I'm still desensitizing you to that. So the kind of real world example, real world as if the internet's not the real world, but it is, but the kind of in-person example that I give with this is, if you were at the bank having a conversation with somebody and they all of a sudden dropped a joke that's of a sexual nature about something that you talked about, you're probably really quickly gonna go, oh, why would you do that? That's weird. That's weird. That's not okay. Youth would probably pick up on that really quickly. But if I was at a party and it's a more casual environment, we have these scripts in our head about what happens at parties or things like that, and somebody drops that joke, I might still notice it and take note of it, but I probably won't have as much of a visceral reaction that there's something wrong there. And that is where the internet can become a little different, is because there is sometimes an expectation or somehow we've built the narrative that everything can be off color or different, or somehow it's not the real world. It's easier to sexualize non-sexual spaces and normalize that. And that starts to desensitize to those pieces. Quick to anger. So this is especially when a boundary has been set or something goes wrong. I think this is a great example of, with like gaming, they lose or something happens. I'm not a gamer. So anybody who's a gamer here is probably like, oh, that's so not the right language. Sorry about that. But this kind of concept of I have an overreaction to something in a really angry and aggressive way, or I have a really strong reaction to a boundary being set. Those are going to be pieces that I really pay attention to and that we can think about. Entitlement, this is really common, right? I'm owed this. You owe me this for being able to stay here or being able to be part of this group that validates your identities. I am actually owed these. And that could be in a sexual context, but it could also not be, right? Isolating or creating dependency. This is that piece of like, I'm moving you from this group shared space to a more private space where people aren't paying as much attention. Or I'm the only person who can meet this need for you, right? And exploiting those aspects. Encouraging rule breaking. So one of the other things that exploiters will often try to do with youth is make them feel complicit in what's happening. So their parents or caregivers or other folks who are adults in their life have set limits or boundaries about where they're supposed to be going, what apps they're supposed to be using, kind of that kind of approach to things. And the exploiter encourages them to violate that, because then it can start to use the tool of, well, you'll get in trouble too, right? Or when we're talking about sextortion, which is often this idea of, you can use it with sexting, right? You sent this picture to me as your partner. I am now saying, If you walk away from me, you tell anybody that I've been crossing boundaries or doing things that's uncomfortable, I'm going to post this other places, right? But even getting a youth to send a nude picture, right? Most of the time, we tell you, don't do this. This is bad. This is a problem. If they did it, which is very common, and we talked about that this morning, then it can also feel like now more bad stuff has happened. But if I tell anybody about it, I'm going to get in trouble, right? And the offender or the exploiter is going to continue to kind of overlay that. So these are some common behaviors to really pay attention to. And these are things that we can, tangibly and practically talk to youth about and say, this isn't just if somebody's making you uncomfortable. This is where we can really bring this into practical skills. Give examples of what persistence can look like outside of a sexual realm, right? Give examples of encouraging you to break rules, or this quick to anger, that like, it's okay to trust your instincts, that something's wrong here, right? And as adults, we need to be paying attention to this as well. Are we seeing that? Are they telling us a story because it's not a sexual context? And you start to pick up on these behaviors in that about somebody that they're interacting with online or talking to more through digital means because everything's on the computer, but they know this person in real life. So paying attention to these behaviors also gives us really practical things that we can talk with youth about and that we can look for ourselves. So how does technology play a role in grooming? Because like I've said, the behaviors and the tactics tend to be very similar. So where does technology come into this? And I've given some examples, but just really thinking about it. One, it creates access. You're going to have contact with people that maybe you wouldn't as easily have had access to. And it provides exploiters or offenders easier ins in some cases to talk with youth. There's also a privacy component to it and an ability to control the narrative that the offender gets to do. So if you had a circumstance where you had, a young man, maybe 14, 15, and he was out in the world with an older woman or an older man or whoever it is, right? That visibly people could see, well, that's weird, right? Or that feels odd. There's no prying eyes, right? In an internet space. There's no ability for us as people to get the validation that like, there might be something odd here. And the exploiter is the one who gets to control that narrative. And if the youth starts to say, I don't know if this is so great or whatever, they can quickly undermine that because they're the only one there with the voice. And that's a really, really powerful piece. And this is where grooming in face-to-face kind of ways, often there will be an effort to isolate for that same purpose. But the internet or a cell phone or a gaming app or any of those things can naturally create those spaces to control and isolate that narrative. It normalizes inappropriate communication. Janice talked about this, kind of this disembodiedness that we experience, that like what's happening in my mind is not the same thing as what's happening in my body. And the virtual world is a different world and it's not as bad, or this is really normal, or this is just the nature of what happens online. And so us being able to kind of rewrite that story for youth, not that it's not going to be there, but how do we help challenge that this is what you should expect to happen if you're on the internet, right? Or in these different spaces, and be able to say, no, that's not okay. And start to challenge that. But right now, that is the nature of what we tend to see online, and so where it can become more effective. for grooming. Same thing, exploit the environmental expectations of those spaces. A little bit like, what do we expect in a bank versus what do we expect at a party? Technology can also speed up the process. Grooming can last for a very, very long time when it's happening in person. It still can last for a long time when it's happening in kind of the virtual world or digital presence, but it can be faster for all of these reasons, right? There may be somebody may be going online explicitly seeking support and connection around sexuality or those different kinds of needs. And so then we're starting at a completely different point in that grooming process that you wouldn't necessarily be starting in all cases in person. And then all these other things, being able to control the narrative, normalizing the conversation, desensitizing it so much faster. So there is a reality that technology can make this process kind of go at a more rapid pace. It can also create accidental situations. So this can be one of those pieces of, I didn't know that my webcam, was on and you could see me getting dressed or standing up. I didn't know that you didn't, I accidentally messaged you this pornographic picture, right? Oops, I didn't mean to send that to you. But the reality is they probably did. And it was part of that intentional because, again, this is that desensitizing and starting that kind of process. But it provides them a lot more plausible deniability in it. And it can make it harder to see that this is actually a manipulative step. So, well, I do think the behaviors and the actions that are happening for grooming tend to be very similar, whether we're face-to-face and things that we're paying attention to. But there is a very real reality that technology can play a role in what that looks like. Again, that doesn't mean that we need to bar youth from technology because that's not reasonable, or that we need to be terrified of it, because what we're actually doing for prevention is focusing on those behaviors and those actions, because technology is just the tool through which it occurs. It's not actually responsible for the grooming, or that it's somehow very different. So what do we do? I talked a little bit about, and I'm just going to introduce these concepts because some of them will be talked about more in depth in some of the future workshops. I already talked about some of the behaviors that we want to pay attention to and that we can notice and intangibly talk with youth about and look for ourselves. And that's part of the understanding the tactics. The more that we can understand what it is that offenders use against youth, the more opportunity that we have to go, all right, how do I undermine that? How do I recognize that this is a normal part of the process? How do I recognize that this is happening? And what are the things that I can do to equip youth and to also pay attention to myself or things that we can do differently? And one of the primary things that we can do is fill the jar ourselves, right? How do we meet as many of those needs that are really developmentally expected for youth as possible, and take away spaces for those offenders to fill up? And this doesn't, and if you're a parent here, you're thinking about kids in your life and you're going, my kid won't even talk to me. I can't possibly fill all of their needs or answer their questions. I don't think it's your responsibility to do all of that. And I don't actually think it's terribly healthy for you to be the one and only person who's responsible for that. This is where we start to reach out and go, what are the other safe, healthy connections that we can do? How do we view, and this is where our panel tomorrow afternoon is really intended around this, is how do we pay attention to the youth programs that are in our communities that we often look at as extracurricular, like camps or sports programs or the pool or any of those things. We often look at those things as extracurricular, and I'm going to argue, and this is what our panel is about to educate or share some of the youth programs in the community. I argue that actually those youth programs are filling the jar. They are meeting needs of connection and identity and community and self-esteem and physicality and filling time and all of those things. They are putting very important pieces into that jar that take away space from people exploiting youth. And so how do we start to think about filling the jar ourselves? Role model and expect healthy boundaries. The more that our youth can experience what healthy communications and interactions and boundaries are, the easier it is for them to recognize when those things are not being respected in other spaces and by other people who are adults or older or even peers. This is fully what Lynn and my other colleague Andrea are going to be talking about in the next section, is really digging into that and what can that look like. This is a terrifying one, but it's something to really think about. Change from an if to a when approach. We need to stop going to this place that youth aren't going to experience in some way some kind of boundary violation or exposure to sexual content or a biased comment or discriminatory or hateful comment from somebody when they are engaging with other people or especially engaging in the virtual world. That is almost unrealistic, right? So if we switch to the when it happens approach, then we can start to go, okay, what are the other skills that we need? How do we try to intervene really early and support that youth should it happen? And depending on what it is, that intervention is going to look really different. Place the responsibility where it belongs. We need to, help teens, hopefully, or youth, prevent harm from happening or recognize the risks with certain behaviors or things of that nature. Yes, of course, we hope that they will make decisions that potentially don't increase their risk. But if something goes wrong, sexting is the great example, right? They made a choice. We oftentimes will still do a lot of blame unintentionally on the young person for why did you do it in the first place? And the reality is that we can have those conversations and we can help establish some boundaries and talk about that. But the harm that has come is because somebody outside of their control and choice shared it with other people or posted it online. And that's the person who has actually needs to be held responsible for their actions and behaviors and the harm that they've caused. So being really clear about where the responsibility lies and make sure that we are trying to keep that lens when we are working with or supporting youth. I like to think of the consider the amnesty approach because we also want to hear about things. Like this undermines one of those tactics that offenders use is you'll get in trouble too. We've done a really great job of talking about this with alcohol and parties is you can call us at any time. You're not going to get punished. You're not going to get in trouble even if you were drinking. But I want you to call me instead of getting in a car with somebody who's drunk or who's been drinking. I would encourage a similar kind of approach for things like sexting or sexual boundary violations or things that maybe we ideally would have not wanted them to engage in, but they did. And if they fear that they're going to get in trouble or have all their independence taken away or punished, we're giving a lot of power to the exploiter as opposed to encouraging our youth to come and talk to us and see if we can get some help and intervention there. And then support youth if they're exploited, right? And that's really thinking about, there are a number of resources that are in the world. I kind of think about them locally as some immediate resources of if somebody has been victimized and they are needing support, whether it's family or youth. Locally, the Advocacy Center can obviously help with that. Folks in a lot of different communities here, you likely have local resources of your local domestic or sexual violence organization or child advocacy centers in a number of communities. So Google search will pull some of that up, or you could always give us a call and we can get connected. In some cases, the New York State Child Abuse Hotline might be a resource, depending how that falls in. And if there was a criminal act, local law enforcement might be an option. Organizational support. So our youth are also still engaging with other systems. And some of this can be prevention, but also even if something is being investigated or there's, that formal system response in there, which is not going to be the reality for every instance, that youth is probably still going to school or sports programs or engaging with youth programs. And that can actually be a really critical piece of their healing. So really thinking about, are there still some needs and how do we reestablish that? And then there's a lot of prevention resources, and we can send some more information about all these things. So with that said, I feel like I have talked at you quite a bit. Do people have any questions in the next 5 minutes-ish? And if not, that is okay too. Okay, so I'm going to drop my email into the chat. I'm sometimes a little busy, but if you have questions, please feel free to reach out. We will be sending out links to the recordings and some more resources going forward. But I so appreciate people joining in and being here. And I really hope you will be able to join the next talk, which is building healthy connections in a virtual world. My colleagues Lynn and Andrea will be presenting that and really going more deeply into this kind of idea about boundaries and how we can really help as adults and our responsibility and roles in keeping youth safe. So thank you all so much. And we will talk to you hopefully soon. Have a good rest of your afternoon, everyone.